In the bushes right where Suzanne was discovered, investigators recovered a Fresca soda bottle. The placement mattered. It was not simply nearby, it was located precisely at the spot where Suzanne Jovan lay. The bottle carried Suzanne's fingerprints, confirming she had handled it. It also bore an unknown partial palm print that did not match hers. From the earliest hours of the investigation, that single object suggested proximity. Another person had been close enough to leave a trace, and it created an expectation that identification might follow. Investigators also collected DNA scrapings from beneath Suzanne's fingernails, indicating a possible struggle. At the time, the expectation was straightforward. Forensic science would provide clarity where witnesses could not. Advances in DNA analysis were already transforming difficult cases across the country. Many believed it was only a matter of time before the samples taken from Suzanne would identify the person responsible. For a period, science appeared to be the most promising path forward. That expectation did not survive later review. In 2009, forensic examination determined that the fingernail DNA had been contaminated by a laboratory technician at the Connecticut State Police Forensic Laboratory. The contamination rendered the sample unreliable. What had once seemed like the strongest scientific lead collapsed, not because evidence was absent, but because it could no longer be trusted. The setback was decisive, undercutting the belief that a clean, definitive answer would emerge from the lab. The Fresca bottle, too, resisted resolution. Despite repeated testing and comparison against known prints, the partial palm print has never been conclusively matched to any suspect. Over time, the evidence continued to imply another person's presence without identifying who that person was. Each re-examination renewed hope. Each time, the results stopped short. Together, the bottle and the compromised DNA came to represent the case itself. Signals of proximity without identification, promise without conclusion. To understand why those hopes mattered so much, investigators had to reconstruct the final hours that led Suzanne to that quiet residential street. Suzanne Jovan was a 21-year-old senior at Yale University whose final evening began with expectations that appeared ordinary, limited, and safe. On Friday, December 4, 1998, she spent the evening on campus completing student responsibilities. She had been organizing a pizza party for the Best Buddies program at Trinity Lutheran Church, a volunteer effort that reflected her reputation as dependable and service-oriented. Nothing about the task suggested conflict or risk. The night began as a continuation of routine. Throughout the evening, Suzanne moved between familiar campus locations. Friends later recalled that she appeared calm and focused. She was not rushing and she was not distressed. At 9:02 p.m., she sent a short email referencing the return of GRE study materials she had borrowed. The message was practical and forward-looking. It suggested closure rather than uncertainty. Whatever Suzanne believed she was doing next, it appeared to be the last small obligation of the day. Suzanne was last seen alive at approximately 9:25 p.m., walking north on College Street near Phelps Gate. Witnesses described her as alone and composed. She did not appear lost, fearful, or hurried. This moment is critical because it captures expectation at its clearest. Suzanne believed the night was under control. She was navigating a familiar environment at a pace that suggested confidence, not caution. Late-night movement around Yale was common. Students frequently walked short distances after dark, even in December. Suzanne had lived and studied in New Haven long enough to feel comfortable moving through areas she knew well. The assumption, hers and that of those who knew her, was that routine equaled safety. Nothing in that final sighting suggested otherwise. Reality arrived quickly and without warning. At 9:55 p.m., New Haven Emergency Services received a call reporting an injured woman on Edge Hill Road, a quiet residential street in the East Rock neighborhood. Responding officers found Suzanne there. Despite medical intervention, she did not survive. The distance between her last sighting and where she was, discovered immediately disrupted every assumption about her final movements. Edge Hill Road was more than 2 miles from Yale's central campus. Only 25 to 30 minutes separated Suzanne's last confirmed sighting and the emergency call. Traveling that distance on foot within that time frame, particularly on a cold December night, was highly unlikely. This narrow window reinforced one of the investigation's earliest and most enduring theories. Suzanne was likely driven to Edge Hill Road. How, by whom, and why remain unanswered. The location itself deepened the mystery. Edge Hill Road was not part of a routine route connected to Suzanne's known activities. It was residential, quiet, and removed from student traffic. Suzanne had no documented reason to be there. The gap between expectation and outcome was no longer abstract. It was physical and difficult to reconcile. At the scene, other early details shaped the investigation. Suzanne's personal belongings were still with her. There were no signs of robbery. There was no evidence of sexual assault. These facts quickly pushed investigators away from theories of random street crime. The violence appeared targeted, yet the context that would explain it was missing. Somewhere between leaving College Street and arriving on Edge Hill Road, Suzanne's expectations no longer matched the reality she encountered. Witness accounts added urgency. Several residents reported seeing a man running from the area around the time of the attack. He was described as a blond man wearing a green jacket. This individual became known publicly as the Running Man. His sighting became a major investigative focus. Whether he was directly involved, a witness fleeing the scene, or unrelated has never been conclusively determined. Despite appeals and sustained attention, his identity has never been confirmed. The sighting suggested haste and sudden movement. Something had gone wrong, quickly. As detectives worked backward, they attempted to align evidence with decision-making. The 9:02 p.m. email about GRE materials supported the idea that Suzanne was finishing a final task. The short timeline and distance reinforced the likelihood that she did not travel alone. The absence of theft or sexual assault suggested the encounter was not random, yet none of these elements explained why Suzanne was on Edge Hill Road that night, or why the assumptions guiding her movements failed so completely. In the days and weeks that followed, the Yale community and the city of New Haven searched for answers. Vigils were held. Hundreds of tips were submitted. The investigation expanded across locations, timelines, and personal connections. Still, progress proved uneven. Without witnesses who could trace Suzanne's entire route, without uncontaminated DNA, and without a clear motive, the case resisted closure. Public attention intensified over the years, particularly around individuals connected to Suzanne's academic life. One name surfaced repeatedly in media coverage: James Van de Velde, a former Yale professor who had served as Suzanne's senior thesis advisor. His public identification as a suspect shaped perception, but it is critical to distinguish attention from legal action. James Van de Velde was never arrested, never charged, and never prosecuted in connection with Suzanne Jovan's murder. While he was publicly identified as a suspect during earlier stages of the investigation, no criminal case was ever filed against him. In 2013, the New Haven state's attorney formally stated that Van de Velde was no longer a suspect. That same year, Van de Velde reached a monetary settlement with Yale University and the city of New Haven to resolve a civil rights lawsuit related to how he had been publicly treated during the investigation. This was a civil matter, not a criminal proceeding, and it did not involve dismissed charges. The murder investigation itself remained open. If you enjoy watching true crime documentaries, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I've got more interesting true crime videos coming up. Moving on to Case 2. The Gilgo Four became known to the public in December 2010, but their story did not begin there, and it does not exist in isolation. Their deaths sit inside a much longer timeline defined by late-night meetings, shifting control, and deliberate choices about space and timing. Between 2007 and 2010, women working as sex workers along Long Island and New York City accepted after-hours appointments that followed familiar routines. Calls were exchanged. Locations were agreed upon. Pickups were arranged. On the surface, these encounters appeared ordinary. What made them dangerous was not confrontation, but how quickly control moved from shared agreement to one-sided decision-making. Late-night meetings carried built-in vulnerabilities. Darkness reduced visibility. Fewer people were awake. Roads were quieter. Once a woman entered a vehicle, control over direction, distance, and duration quietly shifted. The meeting no longer belonged to both people equally. The ability to leave depended on someone else deciding when it ended. This imbalance did not rely on visible force. It relied on environment and timing, repeated often enough to become method. Maureen Brainerd Barnes disappeared in July 2007 after traveling from Connecticut to New York to meet a client. She had done similar trips before. The arrangement followed rules she understood. Transportation was set, communication was clear. The assumption was that she would return home. She did not. Years later, her remains were found along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach, placed in thick brush beside a roadway designed for speed rather than stopping. The location was isolated but accessible, chosen to delay discovery rather than prevent it entirely. Melissa Barthelemy disappeared in July 2009 after advertising escort services in New York City. In the weeks that followed, her family received disturbing phone calls from someone using her phone. The calls often came late at night and were described as controlled rather than emotional. They extended dominance beyond her disappearance, turning absence into an ongoing presence. When her remains were discovered in December 2010, they were positioned near those of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, reinforcing the idea that this was not a single incident, but a repeated approach. In June 2010, Megan Waterman was last seen leaving a Holiday Inn in Hauppauge, New York, after arranging a late-night meeting. Hotel surveillance footage confirmed her departure. The meeting was expected to be brief. Once she entered the vehicle, the balance shifted. The destination was no longer negotiated. The timeline was no longer shared. Her remains were found 6 months later along Ocean Parkway, within the same narrow stretch where the others were later discovered. Amber Lynn Costello disappeared in September 2010 from West Babylon, New York. She agreed to meet a client late at night after prior contact. Neighbors saw her leave the house. The setting felt familiar, which created a sense of safety. The moment she stepped away from it, control over timing and exit moved elsewhere. When her remains were found in December 2010, investigators confirmed that 4 women had been placed within roughly a quarter mile of each other along the same roadway. These 4 became known collectively as the Gilgo 4. The discovery began on December 11, 2010, during a police search for another missing woman, Shannon Gilbert. Officers searching near Oak Beach found the first set of remains along Ocean Parkway. Over the next several days, 3 more sets were located nearby. The proximity reshaped the investigation. These were no longer separate missing person cases. They were connected by geography, victim profile, and circumstance. The late-night meetings were no longer background detail. They were the point of entry. As searches expanded in early 2011, the scope of the case widened dramatically. By April 2011, at least 11 sets of remains had been identified along Long Island's barrier islands and nearby inland areas. 2 of those victims, Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack, demonstrated that the use of Ocean Parkway was not the beginning of the pattern, but part of its evolution. Jessica Taylor's partial remains were first discovered in 2003 in the Manorville Woods, an inland area of Suffolk County. Years later, additional remains linked to her were found along Ocean Parkway, connecting her case to the same corridor as the Gilgo 4. Valerie Mack followed a similar pattern. Some of her remains were discovered in Manorville in 2000, with additional remains later recovered near Ocean Parkway. These cases showed a deliberate geographic spread. Inland dumping grounds first, followed by coastal placement that offered consistency and delay. After more than a decade without an arrest, the case shifted in July 2023, when Rex Hoyerman, a Manhattan architect, was arrested and charged in connection with multiple Gilgo Beach murders. Since that arrest, prosecutors have expanded the case. Hoyerman is now charged with the murders of 7 women: Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, Jessica Taylor, Sandra Castilla, and Valerie Mack. He has pleaded not guilty, and the proceedings remain ongoing. Court records introduced a significant piece of evidence that reinforced the idea of calculated, intentional control. Prosecutors disclosed a deleted Word document recovered from Hoyerman's computer. District Attorney Ray Tierney has explicitly described this document as a blueprint. In court, he characterized it as evidence of self-education and homework on how to carry out sexual murder. The timing of the document is critical. Prosecutors stated that it was created around the year 2000, the same period as Valerie Mack's murder. The document reportedly contained structured notes and reminders rather than emotional writing. It also included specific geographic references, including Mill Road, an area near where Valerie Mack's remains were first discovered in Manorville. This detail anchored planning to real locations, supporting the argument that site selection was researched rather than impulsive. The term blueprint was used deliberately. Prosecutors argued that the document showed preparation, repetition, and refinement. Late-night meetings reduced witnesses. Private vehicles controlled movement. Remote locations delayed discovery. These were not spontaneous decisions made under pressure. They were elements of a method repeated over years. As of January 2026, the case has entered a more defined legal phase. A judge has set a firm trial date for Hoyerman, stating that the trial will begin shortly after Labor Day 2026, come hell or high water. The statement signaled the court's intent to move the case forward without further delay after years of investigation and pretrial litigation. At the same time, the defense is aggressively challenging the prosecution's evidence. Defense attorneys are attempting to suppress several key items, arguing they are prejudicial or were obtained through unreasonable searches. Among the most contested pieces is DNA evidence recovered from a discarded pizza crust. Prosecutors allege that the DNA links Hoyerman to one of the victims. The defense argues that the collection and use of this evidence violate constitutional protections. As the legal process continues, we now turn our focus to the third case. Federal court records revealed that Aaron David Robinson killed Vanessa Guillen because she saw a photo on his phone that could have ended his military career. The image showed Robinson's girlfriend, Cecily Aguilar, who at the time was still legally married to another soldier. Robinson feared Guillen would report him for fraternization, a violation of Army regulations that carried serious disciplinary consequences. That fear of punishment, of exposure, of losing status became the trigger. What followed was not an impulsive confrontation with a stranger, but a calculated act rooted in panic inside a familiar system. Vanessa Guillen was 20 years old and held the rank of Private First Class, PFC, when she disappeared from Fort Hood on April 22, 2020. She was assigned to routine duties on the large military installation near Killeen, Texas. Guillen lived and worked in an environment built on structure, repetition, and trust in hierarchy. Soldiers were expected to move between secure locations, assist one another with tasks, and operate under the assumption that shared rules created shared safety. On that day, Guillen followed the same patterns she always had. Nothing about her schedule suggested she was walking into danger. Earlier that afternoon, Guillen was working in the armory where she was regularly assigned. Investigative reports later confirmed that her personal property was found there: her military identification card, her car keys, and the key to her barracks room. These items were left behind in the armory room where she had been working earlier that day, indicating she did not expect to be gone for long. There was no sign she was preparing to leave base or disappear. The setting reflected routine, not distress. At some point, Guillen left her assigned armory to assist with work-related tasks at a second armory on base. This movement was not unusual. Soldiers at Fort Hood frequently transitioned between secured locations as part of daily operations. The request did not raise alarms because it came from within the system. The second armory belonged to Robinson, a fellow soldier operating under the same command structure. Familiarity did the work that caution did not. Guillen had no clear reason to suspect danger. Inside that second armory, the crime occurred. According to investigative findings, Robinson attacked Guillen with a hammer, striking her repeatedly. The violence happened quickly, inside a controlled military space meant for accountability and oversight. There was no forced entry. There was no outside intruder. Guillen did not leave the armory alive. The threat did not come from an unknown presence, but from someone who belonged there, someone shielded by the same assumptions of safety that defined the environment. What followed was not a call for help, but an attempt to erase what had happened. Surveillance footage later showed Robinson removing a large case from the armory and loading it into a vehicle. Guillen's absence was eventually noticed, but the presence of her personal belongings in her own armory complicated early assumptions about where she had gone and why. The base continued operating. Time passed. Her family waited. For weeks, Guillen's family pressed for answers as uncertainty deepened. They organized independent search efforts, contacted media outlets, and challenged Army leadership about the pace and transparency of the investigation. The case began to draw national attention because it violated a core assumption: that a soldier could not simply vanish from a U.S. military base without immediate explanation. Fort Hood was supposed to be controlled. Guillen was supposed to be accounted for. The longer the silence lasted, the more unsettling it became. On June 30, 2020, the search reached a grim conclusion. Human remains were discovered near the Leon River in Bell County, Texas. Authorities later confirmed they belonged to Vanessa Guillen. Court records showed that Robinson, with Aguilar's assistance, had transported Guillen's body off base. Investigators determined that the remains had been dismembered and burned in an effort to destroy evidence before being buried. The discovery confirmed what her family had feared, but it did not yet explain why it had happened. The following day, July 1, 2020, law enforcement moved to arrest Robinson. When officers attempted to take him into custody, he fled and died by suicide from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His death ended the possibility of a full criminal trial. There would be no testimony from Robinson, no cross-examination, and no direct courtroom explanation of his actions. That same day, the U.S. Army posthumously promoted Vanessa Guillen from Private First Class to Specialist SPC, formally recognizing her service. For a time, Robinson's death left the motive unresolved. Public understanding stalled at the surface details of the crime. It was not until 2022, through federal court proceedings involving Aguilar, that the motive became clear. Aguilar admitted that Robinson killed Guillen because she saw the photo on his phone, and he feared she would report him for fraternization. The killing was driven by fear of discipline and loss of status. It was an act meant to silence a perceived threat to his career. Aguilar's role extended beyond knowledge of the motive. She assisted Robinson after the killing, helping transport Guillen's body and participating in efforts to conceal the crime. She also lied to investigators during the early stages of the search, contributing to delays and uncertainty. Her actions became central to understanding how the crime remained hidden for so long. As investigators continued their work, attention returned to Guillen's experiences before her death. Her family had stated that she told them she was being sexually harassed and feared retaliation if she reported it. Early Army statements denied that Guillen had filed formal complaints. Later investigations clarified a crucial distinction. Investigators found no evidence that Robinson had sexually harassed Guillen. However, an official report confirmed that she had been sexually harassed on 2 occasions by a different supervisor in a separate unit. These incidents were substantiated and had not been properly addressed at the time, contradicting earlier public denials. The broader environment at Fort Hood became part of the story. A Department of Defense independent review committee later concluded that the base suffered from serious leadership and command climate failures. The report cited inconsistent discipline, poor oversight, and a culture that discouraged reporting. These conditions did not cause the murder, but they created an environment where fear of consequences, both for victims and perpetrators, could shape behavior in dangerous ways. Aguilar eventually faced the legal consequences Robinson did not. In 2023, she was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, the maximum penalty available for her role as an accessory after the fact and for making false statements. During sentencing, her admissions clarified the motive and the steps taken to conceal Guillen's death. The sentence brought partial legal resolution, but it did not erase the institutional failures exposed by the case. Vanessa Guillen's death had consequences far beyond Fort Hood. Public demonstrations spread across the United States. The phrase, "I am Vanessa Guillen," became a rallying call for service members who felt unsafe or unheard. The case accelerated reforms to how sexual harassment and assault are reported and handled within the military. Fort Hood itself was later renamed Fort Cavazos as part of broader efforts to signal change. If you found this video interesting so far, I would really appreciate it if you could take a moment to help my channel grow by liking the video and subscribing to my channel. Thanks for the support. We now move to the fourth case. June 4, 2016, marked the end of Kelvin Julius's life in Birmingham, Alabama, during the quietest hours of the night. At around 2:30 a.m., the city was mostly still. Streets were empty. Homes were dark. At that hour, Kelvin, just 15 years old, was sitting inside a car near the intersection of 12th Street South and 3rd Avenue South, waiting for help. The car had broken down. What should have been a brief pause in the night became the final moment of his life. Kelvin had left home late that night without telling his mother exactly where he was going. There was nothing unusual about that for a teenager. He was not heading toward trouble, nor was he seeking confrontation. According to police and family statements, he was not involved in any dispute, argument, or criminal activity. He was simply present. He was waiting. That wait placed him in the wrong location at the wrong moment, surrounded by danger he could not see. As Kelvin remained inside the disabled vehicle with a young female friend, gunfire erupted nearby. The shots came suddenly and without warning. Multiple rounds were fired in rapid succession. Kelvin was struck and killed at the scene. The young woman sitting with him was also shot but survived and was taken to a hospital for treatment. When police arrived, the shooters were already gone, leaving behind a scene that made little sense to those who first responded. Investigators soon determined that the shooting was not random, but Kelvin was not the intended target. Authorities believed the gunfire was connected to retaliation stemming from a prior conflict involving other individuals. The violence had a purpose, but Kelvin was not part of it. He had no role in what triggered the shooting. His family would later describe the tragedy in simple terms that carried heavy truth. Wrong place, wrong time. That phrase was not meant to minimize what happened. It was the most accurate description available. Late-night visits often feel harmless. Streets feel calmer after midnight. Fewer people are around. For many teenagers, those hours feel like freedom borrowed from the day. In Kelvin's case, nothing about the moment he arrived suggested danger. The car trouble forced him to stay longer than expected, and that delay placed him directly inside the path of gunfire meant for someone else. Time became the boundary he could not cross back over. Waiting in the car was not a reckless decision. It was practical. Leaving the vehicle would not have solved the problem. Remaining where he was felt safe. That assumption is one people make every day without consequence. What makes this case so difficult to accept is that there was no clear warning sign, no raised voices, no visible conflict unfolding nearby. The violence arrived instantly, giving Kelvin no chance to react or escape. 2 adult men were later arrested and charged in connection with the shooting. Ian Tinsley, who was 22 years old, and Carlos McCain, who was 19, both faced serious charges, including murder and attempted murder. Prosecutors alleged that they were involved in the gunfire that struck Kelvin and the young woman in the car. As the case moved through the legal system, it became clear that the outcomes would not be the same for both defendants. Ian Tinsley ultimately pleaded guilty to murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. His guilty plea established legal responsibility for his role in the events of that night. For Kelvon's family, the sentence did not ease their grief, but it confirmed that at least one person would be held accountable for the loss of their son. Carlos McCain's case followed a different path. In January 2018, after a jury trial, McCain was found not guilty of murder and attempted murder. Jurors concluded that prosecutors had not proven his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Case 5. Tess Ricci was 22 years old in November 2017 when a late-night outing in downtown Toronto ended in a crime that would later be reconstructed in court with exacting detail and would reveal how violence can occur quietly, only steps away from busy streets and open businesses. Tess was originally from North Bay, Ontario, and had moved to Toronto at the age of 19 to attend Seneca College, where she was building an independent life. By 2017, the city was no longer temporary for her, it was home. On the night of Saturday, November 25, 2017, Tess went out with a friend in Toronto's Church Wellesley Village, an area known for nightlife, bars, and steady foot traffic well past midnight. It was a familiar part of the city, active and well-lit, often associated with a sense of safety because of the number of people around. The night followed a common pattern: socializing, moving between venues, waiting out closing time. Late that night, Tess and her friend were asked to leave the bar cruise and tangos, a routine occurrence as venues close or manage capacity. Outside, near a hot dog cart on Church Street, they stopped briefly. Trial evidence later established that this was where Tess first encountered Kaylin Schlatter. The meeting was brief and unremarkable on the surface, the kind of interaction that rarely draws attention when crowds are dispersing and people are figuring out how to get home. Shortly afterward, Tess's friend left to catch an Uber. Tess remained behind. Surveillance footage later showed Tess and Schlatter together in the area. To someone watching the footage without context, the interaction appeared calm. There was no visible struggle, no obvious distress. But prosecutors would later argue that this appearance was misleading. According to the Crown, Schlatter deliberately targeted Tess once she was alone, engaged her in conversation, and misled her away from the busier stretch of Church Street, steering her toward a more isolated area. That moment marked the last confirmed public sighting of Tess alive. Court evidence later revealed another critical detail. Tess attempted to order an Uber for herself shortly before her death. The ride request was canceled because she never reached the pickup point. That fact became significant at trial. It indicated that Tess was trying to leave the area independently and safely, but something prevented her from doing so. When Tess failed to return home and stopped responding to messages, concern grew quickly. Friends initially assumed she may have gone home another way or fallen asleep. By the next day, it was clear something was wrong. Tess was not known to disappear without explanation. Toronto police opened a missing person investigation, treating the case as a disappearance rather than a confirmed crime. Tess's family acted immediately. They traveled to Toronto and began searching on their own, retracing Tess's last known movements through the Church Wellesley area. Posters were printed and distributed. Volunteers joined the search. Family members checked alleyways, doorways, construction sites, and nearby buildings repeatedly. The neighborhood was dense with residential properties and shared spaces. The belief was simple and urgent. If Tess was nearby, someone would notice. For 4 days, the case remained officially a missing person investigation. There was no declared crime scene, no confirmed evidence of violence. Hope remained, but it narrowed with every hour. On November 29, 2017, the search ended in the most devastating way possible. Tess's mother and a family friend, continuing their own search near where Tess was last seen, entered a property at 582 Church Street. The building was under renovation or construction at the time. At the rear of the property, they discovered Tess's body in an outdoor basement stairwell, a recessed stairwell leading down from ground level, partially hidden from the sidewalk and public view. The discovery was not made by police during a targeted search. It was made by family members who refused to stop looking. The location immediately raised troubling questions. The building at 582 Church Street was close to Tess's last known location. Police officers had been in the area earlier during the missing person investigation, but did not search the property, despite being called nearby. That failure would later result in disciplinary action against two officers, Alan McCullough and Michael Jones, for not properly searching the exact site where Tess was found. An autopsy later confirmed that Tess's cause of death was neck compression and strangulation. Investigators determined that she had been killed shortly after her disappearance. She had not been alive in the stairwell for days. The delay was not in the crime, but in its discovery. The case was reclassified as a homicide. As investigators reconstructed Tess's final hours, attention returned to the man last seen with her. Kaylin Schlatter was arrested and charged. While surveillance footage and timelines were important, the case was not based on circumstantial evidence alone. Physical forensic evidence became central. Forensic testing found Schlatter's DNA, both semen and saliva, on Tess's clothing. This evidence was critical. At trial, prosecutors argued it proved Tess had been sexually assaulted and that the assault was directly connected to her murder. The Crown's theory was clear. Schlatter targeted Tess after her friend left, made sexual advances that Tess rejected, and then sexually assaulted and strangled her in the concealed stairwell. Because the killing occurred during a sexual assault, Schlatter was charged with first-degree murder. The legal process was lengthy and complex. Pretrial motions, forensic testimony, and expert evidence stretched the case over several years. Tess's family remained publicly engaged throughout, not only seeking justice for Tess, but also pressing accountability for investigative failures that delayed her discovery. On March 23, 2020, a jury found Kaylin Schlatter guilty of first-degree murder. At sentencing, Schlatter received life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The sentence reflected the gravity of the crime and the jury's acceptance of the Crown's case that the murder was not accidental, impulsive, or secondary, but deliberate and predatory. Schlatter pursued appeals following his conviction. In January 2024, the Ontario Court of Appeal dismissed his appeal after approximately 10 minutes of deliberation, signaling that the court found no merit in the arguments presented. Schlatter then sought leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. In September 2024, the Supreme Court denied leave to appeal, effectively exhausting Schlatter's legal options and bringing the case to a final legal conclusion. We now shift attention to Case 6. Waltham Cross, Hertfordshire, was quiet on the night of 24 December 2015. Hotels along the road were lit and active, hosting guests arriving late for the holidays. Nothing about the setting suggested danger. It was a familiar place, structured and ordinary, the kind of environment people choose precisely because it feels neutral. That night, one of those hotels became the last place Katie Locke was seen alive. Katie Locke was 23 years old. She lived in Hertfordshire and worked as a history teacher. People close to her described her as careful, organized, and deliberate in how she lived her life. She planned. She valued structure. She was not known for taking unnecessary risks. By 2015, online dating had become normal for people her age. Meeting someone in person after exchanging messages was common, not unusual. When Katie agreed to meet a man she had been speaking with online, the decision did not feel reckless. It felt routine. The man she arranged to meet was Carl Langdell. They connected through the dating website Plenty of Fish. Over time, their conversations built familiarity. Langdell presented himself as professional and trustworthy. One detail mattered more than most. He told Katie that he was a lawyer who owned his own firm. That claim carried weight. It suggested education, responsibility, and accountability. It implied a life governed by rules and oversight. The claim was false. Langdell was not a lawyer. He had no firm. The deception worked because it fit expectations and lowered caution before suspicion could form. Their first in-person meeting was arranged for late at night on Christmas Eve. They chose a hotel in Waltham Cross as the meeting place. Hotels are often viewed as safe compromises. They are not private homes. Staff are present. Other guests move through shared spaces. For many people, that setting feels controlled and predictable. The plan was simple. Meet, spend some time together, leave. There was no expectation of danger and no sign at that point that the night would end differently from thousands of similar meetings happening across the country. CCTV footage later showed Katie arriving at the hotel without visible distress. She met Langdell and went with him to a room. There was no argument in public areas, no raised voices, no behavior that would have drawn attention from staff or other guests. From the outside, the meeting appeared ordinary. Once the door closed, however, the environment changed completely. What had been public became private. There were no witnesses inside the room and no immediate access to help. Inside the room, Langdell attacked Katie and strangled her. The killing did not follow a long relationship or escalating conflict. It occurred during a first date. That fact became central to understanding the case. There was no shared history that could have served as warning. The danger did not grow gradually in her presence. It existed before she arrived and was brought into the room by someone who had already formed violent intent. After killing Katie, Langdell committed acts that the court later described as showing extreme depravity. Evidence presented during sentencing established that he sexually assaulted her body after death and took photographs. These acts were not alleged or speculative. They were proven in court and treated as serious aggravating factors. The judge emphasized that they occurred after Katie had already died, reinforcing that Langdell's behavior was driven by violent fantasy and control rather than conflict or reaction. Langdell then moved Katie's body outside the hotel. She was later found on the hotel grounds. Emergency services were called, but she had already died. Police began reconstructing her final movements. Hotel records, CCTV footage, and witness accounts established that Langdell was the last person known to have been with her that night. As hours passed and Katie did not return home, her family began searching for answers. They contacted Langdell through Facebook, asking when he had last seen her. At that point, Langdell lied. He told Katie's family that she had left the hotel in a taxi. The statement was false. It delayed understanding of what had happened and showed an early attempt to mislead those looking for her. Police later located Langdell. As evidence accumulated, he admitted responsibility for the killing. He was arrested and charged with murder. As the case progressed, information about his background emerged that significantly altered how the crime was understood. At the time he killed Katie, Langdell was already serving a suspended prison sentence. Just 3 weeks earlier, he had been sentenced for making threats to kill 2 other people. That meant he was under court supervision when he arranged the date. This detail became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. His dangerous behavior had already been formally recognized by the justice system shortly before Katie's death. Further evidence showed that Langdell had previously told a psychiatric nurse that he had fantasies about killing and raping a woman. This admission was made before the murder. It was documented within the mental health system. Despite this, Langdell was able to live freely, use online dating platforms, and arrange private meetings without restriction. No effective safeguards were put in place to manage the risk he posed to others. Langdell pleaded guilty to murder. In 2016, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years before parole could be considered. The judge cited multiple aggravating factors when passing sentence: the deliberate deception used to gain trust, the nature of the killing, and the abuse that occurred after death. Responsibility was clear and undisputed. Years later, the case returned to public attention through a formal inquest. In 2021, The inquest examined whether Katie Locke's death could have been prevented. Its findings were stark. The inquest concluded that Katie was the victim of significant gaps in information sharing between the police, the NHS, and probation services. Each agency held pieces of information about Langdell's risk. Those pieces were never fully connected. The inquest did not claim that a single failure caused the murder. Instead, it identified fragmentation across systems. Threats known to police were not fully integrated with mental health disclosures. Court supervision did not trigger broader protective measures. Information existed, but it remained siloed. The conclusion was that better coordination and communication could have changed the outcome. Shortly before the inquest concluded, another development occurred. In February 2021, Carl Langdell died by suicide while in custody at Wakefield Prison. His death ended any further legal proceedings involving him. It did not change his conviction or sentence, and it did not alter the inquest's findings, which remained focused on systemic responsibility rather than individual outcome. The story continues as Case 7 comes up next. The first decision point came in the early hours of Saturday, March 19, 2011. At approximately 2:52 a.m., Cian left the Suju nightclub in Swindon. CCTV cameras captured her stepping into the street alone. Friends had already gone their separate ways. Taxis were operating nearby. She could have waited, shared a ride, or stayed inside longer. Instead, she began the walk home. It was a route she knew well. She had taken it before. The street was quiet, familiar, and unremarkable. At that moment, nothing suggested the night was about to fracture. CCTV followed Cian as she moved through the town center. She walked at a steady pace, occasionally looking down at her phone. Her posture was relaxed. There was no sign of urgency or fear. These images later became critical, not because they showed danger, but because they showed how normal everything appeared. This was not a chaotic moment. It was routine. That ordinariness is what makes the case so difficult to process. The risk was invisible. The second decision point came minutes later, outside the view of cameras. Somewhere along her route, a car slowed beside her. The driver was Christopher Hallowell, a local taxi driver who was not on an official job at the time. A brief conversation followed. A lift was offered. Accepting meant warmth, speed, and an easy end to the night. Declining meant continuing alone in the early morning quiet. The choice lasted only seconds. It did not feel dramatic. It did not feel dangerous, but it was the last clear exit available. Once Cian entered the vehicle, the balance of control shifted completely. Phone data later showed her mobile device moving away from Swindon. Instead of heading toward her home, it traveled into rural areas of Wiltshire and Oxfordshire. The familiar streets disappeared. At this point, the sequence of events was no longer shaped by choice. The opportunity to step away had closed. By later that morning, concern began to spread. Cian had not returned home. She had not responded to calls or messages. As hours passed, worry turned into alarm. Wiltshire police launched a missing person investigation. Officers retraced her last known movements. CCTV footage was reviewed frame by frame. Volunteers searched open spaces, paths, and fields. Posters were printed and distributed across Swindon. Each passing hour reduced the number of hopeful explanations. Another decision point emerged during the investigation itself. On March 22, 2011, police stopped Hallowell while he was driving his taxi. He was taken in for questioning by Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher. At that stage, Fulcher believed there was still a possibility that Cian was alive. Acting on that belief, he proceeded under what he understood to be urgent interview rules, questioning Hallowell without a solicitor present. During this questioning, Hallowell disclosed information about Cian's location. He led officers to where her body had been left. On March 24, 2011, 5 days after she went missing, Cian's remains were discovered in a shallow grave near the Uffington White Horse. The search ended. The possibility of rescue was gone. That discovery closed one chapter of the case and opened another, more complex one. The court later ruled that while Fulcher may initially have believed he was acting to save a life, the justification for an urgent interview no longer applied once it became clear that Cian was deceased. Fulcher continued questioning Halliwell about other potential crimes without issuing a formal caution. As a result, key elements of Halliwell's early admissions were ruled inadmissible. This became another missed exit, this time within the justice process itself. Despite these procedural failures, the case against Halliwell did not collapse. Investigators continued to build evidence through other means. Mobile phone data placed him with Cian. Forensic findings supported the timeline. Circumstantial evidence reinforced the conclusions already forming. In October 2012, Halliwell pleaded guilty to Cian O'Callaghan's murder at Bristol Crown Court. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. Case 8. The location where the remains were found added another layer of uncertainty. The site was approximately 30 miles from Bath, indicating that Melanie Hall had been transported a considerable distance. How that journey occurred, whether by car and by whom, remains unknown. The placement of the remains suggested deliberate concealment, but time had removed many potential clues. By the time they were discovered, the landscape had changed, evidence had degraded, and the opportunity to reconstruct the final movements in detail had largely passed. Those remains were discovered on the 5th of October 2009, near the northbound slip road of the M5 motorway at Junction 14, close to Thornbury in South Gloucestershire. They were found inside bin bags by workers clearing vegetation. Forensic testing later confirmed they belonged to Melanie Hall, who had been missing for more than 13 years. The discovery confirmed what had long been feared. Melanie had been murdered. However, it did not explain how, when, or by whom. Only partial skeletal remains were recovered. Because of their condition, investigators were unable to determine a cause of death. No clear timeline could be established between the moment she vanished and the moment her life ended. The discovery answered one question but reopened many others. It shifted the case from a disappearance to a confirmed homicide, while simultaneously locking many answers beyond reach. Several personal items Melanie was wearing on the night she disappeared were never recovered. These included a pale blue silk dress, black suede mule shoes, and her grandmother's gold wedding ring. The absence of these items remains significant. They may indicate removal, disposal, or retention by whoever was responsible. Their continued absence has limited forensic opportunities and remains a key unresolved element of the case. To understand how Melanie ended up beside a motorway miles from where she was last seen, investigators had to return to the beginning. Melanie Hall was 25 years old in June 1996. She lived in Bath, England, and worked as a clerical assistant at the Royal United Hospital. She was known for being dependable and routine-oriented, someone whose movements and habits followed familiar patterns. On Saturday evening, the 8th of June 1996, she went out into the city with friends. It was a normal weekend night. There was no indication of danger, no unusual plans, and no expectation that the night would end any differently from countless others before it. As the night turned into early Sunday, June 9, 1996, Melanie and her group visited several venues before arriving at Cadillac's nightclub. She was not alone that night. Her boyfriend, Philip Kurlbaum, was with her at the club. At some point during the night, the two argued. According to later accounts, Philip left the nightclub afterward. Melanie remained behind. This detail became important later because it explained why she was seen alone without suggesting she had arrived or spent the night in isolation. At approximately 1:10 a.m., Melanie was seen sitting on a stool inside the club near the dance floor. This is the last confirmed sighting of her alive. She was physically alone at that moment, but nothing about the scene appeared unusual. Friends later said she planned to take a taxi home. Taxis regularly waited outside the club at closing time. A woman preparing to leave late at night did not attract attention. There was no disturbance reported. No public confrontation, no visible distress. The earlier argument had already passed, and nothing in her behavior suggested immediate danger. Music continued. Other patrons focused on their own departures. Staff concentrated on closing tasks. The moment passed because it blended into the ordinary flow of the night. When Melanie did not return home, there was no immediate alarm. Missed calls did not instantly suggest something was wrong. Friends and family assumed she might have stayed elsewhere or returned later than expected. Hours passed quietly. That delay became critical. By the time concern turned into urgency, valuable time had already slipped away. Once Melanie was reported missing, police launched an investigation. Officers reconstructed her known movements, interviewed friends, nightclub staff, and taxi drivers, and issued public appeals. Her photograph was circulated across Bath and surrounding areas. Despite these efforts, investigators faced a defining obstacle from the start. No one could say with certainty how Melanie left the nightclub or who she was with when she did. There was no confirmed taxi booking under her name. CCTV coverage from 1996 was limited and incomplete. Some witnesses later suggested they may have seen her talking with a man inside the club, but descriptions varied and could not be conclusively verified. The exact moment when Melanie left the safety of the nightclub environment remained undefined. That absence shaped everything that followed. As days turned into weeks, police followed leads across the region. Each tip required time and verification. Many led nowhere. Without a clear point of departure, investigators were forced to work outward from uncertainty. The case gradually shifted from an active search to a long-term investigation defined by unanswered questions rather than evidence. In November 2004, more than 8 years after Melanie vanished, she was declared legally dead in absentia. The declaration acknowledged the likelihood of her death but did not resolve the case. The investigation remained open. Her family remained without answers. The discovery of her remains in 2009 reactivated the case, but also highlighted how much time had been lost. The 13-year gap between disappearance and recovery meant that physical evidence was limited, memories had faded, and opportunities for immediate forensic analysis were gone. Silence had reshaped the case long before confirmation arrived. Following the identification of the remains, police renewed public appeals. Advances in forensic science offered cautious hope. Old statements were reviewed. Evidence was re-examined. Over the years, several arrests were made in connection with the investigation, but none resulted in charges. Each renewed effort eventually returned to stillness. For many years, the case existed in that state, open, active, but constrained by what could no longer be recovered. In January 2026, investigators announced the most significant procedural development in decades. Detectives began using an artificial intelligence-based investigative system known as the SOZE AI tool to re-examine the case. The system was deployed to review nearly 30 years of material, including thousands of witness statements and approximately 96 hours of CCTV footage collected from the time of Melanie's disappearance. Attention now shifts to Case 9. Steph Irons was 23 years old and living in Mapperley, Nottingham, when her life ended on the night of 21st October 2025. The night did not begin with panic, urgency, or visible danger. It followed a pattern that felt ordinary, shaped by familiarity and routine. Steph was at home, in a space that represented safety and control. Nothing about the night suggested that it would end differently from countless others. The atmosphere was quiet, and the setting was familiar. There were no immediate signs that anything was wrong. Late in the night, a former partner arrived at her home. He was not a stranger, and there was no forced entry. The door was opened willingly. The visit did not carry the outward markers of threat that people often associate with violent crime. This was someone Steph already knew. Someone who had previously been part of her life. That familiarity is a critical detail. It shaped how the interaction began and explains why the situation did not trigger alarm at the outset. Familiar people do not arrive with warning signs. They arrive with shared history. Late-night visits carry a different weight than encounters during the day. By that hour, fatigue is common. Long days dull alertness. Judgment can soften, and people are more likely to rely on instinct rather than caution. Streets grow quieter as the night progresses. Fewer cars pass. Fewer neighbors are awake. Sounds that might attract attention earlier in the day blend into the background. In these conditions, private interactions become more isolated. In Steph's case, police later confirmed that the visitor was Adadapo Adegbola, a 40-year-old former work colleague with whom she had previously had a brief romantic relationship. The visit was not random or accidental. It was rooted in a prior connection, one that carried emotional weight. That history shaped the tone of the encounter from the beginning. Encounters between former partners are rarely neutral. They are influenced by unresolved feelings, expectations, and personal boundaries that are not always clearly defined. Emergency services were called to Steph's address on Westdale Lane West shortly after 10 p.m. The call was made out of concern for her safety. When officers and paramedics arrived, they entered a quiet street and a closed home. Inside, they found Steph with fatal stab wounds. Despite medical efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The timing mattered. By that hour, most people nearby were indoors. The street was calm. There were no crowds and no immediate witnesses who might have noticed distress earlier or interrupted the situation before it escalated. The isolation of the night shaped both the crime and the response. What happened inside the home occurred without public visibility. There was no report of a disturbance outside. No one nearby was alerted until concern was raised through other means. This delay is significant. In many domestic-related killings, violence occurs in private spaces where there is little opportunity for intervention once a situation turns dangerous. Investigators quickly focused on Adegbola as the primary suspect. Police confirmed that he had been at the property shortly before the emergency call. After the attack, he left the area. His movements through nearby towns were later traced, allowing investigators to establish a clear timeline. This sequence of events helped confirm that the violence occurred during that late-night visit, inside the home, away from public view. Eventually, Adegbola surrendered to police, bringing the immediate search to an end. Further details emerged as the investigation progressed. Colleagues later told police that Steph had sent messages earlier that night that caused concern. Those messages prompted people to check on her welfare, which led to the emergency call. This detail matters. It shows that unease existed before authorities were alerted, even if the full extent of the danger was not yet clear. Distance and timing delayed intervention. By the time help arrived, the situation had already turned fatal. In January 2026, Adegbola appeared at Nottingham Crown Court and pleaded guilty to Steph's murder. The guilty plea confirmed the central facts of the case and removed the need for a full trial. Prosecutors outlined the relationship history, the timing of the visit, and the sequence of events that led to Steph's death. The court scheduled sentencing for February 5, 2026, bringing the legal process toward its final stage. The plea established responsibility and accountability, but it could not reverse what had happened during those late-night hours. Case 10. Messages sent to Grace on her birthday went unanswered. Phone calls were not returned. By December 3rd, concern had turned into alarm. Her family contacted authorities. Only later would the public understand what that silence meant. By the time police began retracing her movements, the outcome had already occurred. The city did not yet know it, but the search that followed would not end with Grace being found alive. The consequence was already fixed, waiting to be uncovered. Grace Mullane was 22 years old and traveling alone through New Zealand as part of a year-long trip around the world. She arrived in Auckland in late November 2018. Friends and family described her as careful, organized, and consistently in touch. She shared where she was staying, responded quickly to messages, and made plans openly. Her sudden silence stood out precisely because it was so unlike her. December 2nd, 2018, was Grace's 22nd birthday. The night before, December 1st, she arranged to meet a man she had connected with through a dating app. His name was Jesse Kempson. The meeting appeared ordinary. CCTV footage later showed Grace walking through central Auckland, entering bars, talking, laughing, and moving through crowded streets. Nothing in the footage suggested fear or distress. To anyone watching at the time, it looked like a typical night out in a busy city. In the early hours of December 2nd, Grace and Kempson returned to his room at the City Life Hotel. That is where Grace Mullane died. Forensic evidence later established that she was killed by strangulation during the early morning hours of her birthday. She never left the hotel alive. There were no witnesses to the violence. No emergency call was made. No disturbance was reported. Outside the room, the city continued without interruption. While Grace's family waited for a reply that never came, the hours passed unnoticed by everyone else. Once police became involved on December 3rd, the investigation began without a crime scene or a body. Officers worked backward from absence. They identified Grace's last confirmed movements using CCTV footage from bars, streets, and the hotel. Video showed her entering an elevator with Kempson. There was no footage of her leaving. Phone records placed her final communications inside the hotel room. Keycard data and timestamps narrowed the window further. The case quickly became one built on reconstruction rather than witnesses. As investigators traced Grace's last steps, Kempson continued his routine. Court evidence later confirmed that on December 3rd, after Grace had already been killed, he arranged and went on another date through the same app. While Grace's body remained concealed in his hotel room, he went out in public, ordered food, and behaved normally. Messages, receipts, and surveillance footage confirmed this sequence. The violence had already occurred, yet nothing in his outward behavior suggested urgency or disruption. Police then followed the trail outward from the hotel. CCTV captured Kempson moving a large suitcase. Transport and location data showed travel away from central Auckland. On December 4th, officers searched a remote area in the Waitakere Ranges, west of the city. That same day, Grace Mullane's body was recovered from inside a suitcase hidden in bushland. The investigation immediately shifted from a missing person case to a homicide inquiry. The arrest came on December 8, 2018. By then, police had already established a detailed timeline built almost entirely from digital evidence, CCTV footage, phone activity, location data, and movements after Grace's death. What remained was the legal question of responsibility and intent. During the 2019 trial at the Auckland High Court, Kempson claimed Grace's death was accidental, arguing it occurred during consensual sexual activity. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence showing sustained pressure to the neck, inconsistent with an accident. They also focused on what happened after Grace died: the concealment of her body, the transport of the suitcase, the disposal in a remote area, and the continuation of normal social activity. Each action was presented as deliberate rather than impulsive. There were no dramatic eyewitness accounts in the courtroom. The case relied on sequence. Every decision made after Grace's death pointed backward to responsibility. The jury rejected the defense explanation. In November 2019, Kempson was found guilty of murder. Sentencing followed shortly after. The court imposed life imprisonment with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. In delivering the sentence, the judge emphasized not only the killing itself, but the actions taken afterward, the concealment, the lack of immediate accountability, and the sustained choices made in the days that followed. And now, to the final case. July 2018, Sunbury, Victoria. Late at night, Malin Rathod, a 24-year-old international student, drove to a suburban home after exchanging messages on the dating app Plenty of Fish. The person he was meeting was Jamie Lee Dolagai. By the time Rathod arrived, the court would later determine crucial decisions had already been contemplated, documented through internet searches, reinforced by statements to police, and followed by actions that ignored clear safety boundaries. Late-night meetings often feel casual. Messages flow quickly, plans are made without much ceremony, and the quiet hour creates a sense of privacy. In this case, the plan appeared ordinary on its surface. Rathod and Dolhagi had chatted online and agreed to meet at her home. There was no long relationship, no shared history, and no public argument that might have suggested immediate danger. What the jury later learned, however, was that the most significant indicators were not visible to Rathod and were not unfolding in the room yet. They existed in the hours before he arrived. As the investigation unfolded, prosecutors presented Dolhagai's internet search history from shortly before Rathod came over. These were not generic searches made weeks earlier. They were recent and specific, conducted the same night. Among the phrases placed before the jury were, "I'm going to kill someone tonight for fun," and 10 steps to commit a murder and get away with it. The timing of these searches mattered. They occurred before Rathod entered the house, before any physical encounter began. Prosecutors argued the searches showed fixation and anticipation. The defense challenged their interpretation, suggesting disturbed thinking rather than a settled plan. For the audience, the sequence alone shifts the frame of the story. The risk did not begin with an argument. It preceded the meeting. Rathod arrived at Dolhagai's Sunbury home late that night. There were no witnesses. The environment was private and isolated, conditions that often appear in cases involving late-night visits. According to evidence accepted at trial, the interaction was presented as consensual choke play. Importantly, there was discussion of a safety signal, tapping, to indicate when the activity should stop. This signal was meant to act as a clear boundary. The signal was later used. Court evidence established that Rathod tapped to indicate distress. That signal was ignored. Force continued after he became unresponsive. Prosecutors presented evidence that Dolhagai then used a cord-like cable from an object in the room to continue applying pressure. These findings were not speculative. They were supported by forensic evidence and by Dolhagai's own statements. Emergency services were later called. Rathod was pronounced dead at the scene. Following her arrest, Dolhagi was interviewed by police. During that interview, she made statements that would become central to the prosecution's case. She told officers, "I knew I was going to kill him if he came over." She also compared the urge to kill to the urge to smoke, describing it as something she felt compelled to act on. These were not ambiguous remarks. Prosecutors relied on them to argue that Rathod's death was anticipated. The defense later argued that the statements reflected disturbed thoughts rather than a legally formed intent to kill. The jury would be required to decide how those words fit within the law's narrow definition of intent. Based on the evidence, Dolhagai was charged with murder. The charge reflected the prosecution's position that Rathod's death was intentional, not accidental or merely reckless. The case proceeded to the Supreme Court of Victoria and attracted widespread attention. Media reporting focused on the dating app connection, the late-night visit, and the digital trail uncovered by investigators. Inside the courtroom, however, the focus narrowed to a precise legal question: had intent to kill been proven beyond reasonable doubt? At trial in 2020, jurors heard a structured presentation of evidence, including the pre-arrival Google searches, the ignored safety signal, the continuation of force after Rathod was unresponsive, and the post-arrest admissions to police. The defense did not dispute that Dolhagi caused Rathod's death. Instead, it argued that despite disturbing conduct and statements, the prosecution had not met the strict legal threshold required for murder. Mental health evidence was introduced to explain Dolhagi's state of mind, without denying responsibility. Australian criminal law requires precision. Jurors cannot convict on moral certainty alone. They must determine whether the legal definition of intent has been satisfied. After deliberation, the jury found Dolhagi not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter. The verdict confirmed that Rathod's killing was unlawful and that Dolhagai was criminally responsible. It also reflected the jury's conclusion that, despite evidence of anticipation and fixation, The prosecution had not proven the specific intent required for a murder conviction to the required legal standard. This outcome has often been misunderstood. It does not mean the jury rejected the evidence. It means the jury applied a narrow legal test to it. At sentencing, the judge emphasized the seriousness of the crime and the permanent loss suffered by Rathod's family. The court acknowledged Dolagai's mental health issues, but made clear they did not excuse her actions. Dolagay received a substantial prison sentence with a non-parole period set under Victorian law. In sentencing remarks, the judge identified the deliberate ignoring of safety signals and the continuation of force as aggravating factors. If you enjoyed watching this true crime documentary, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.